Dawn in. Eastern Ukraine arrives slowly. The horizon does not brighten all at once. Instead, the darkness lifts in quiet layers, revealing shapes that had been hidden through the night. Trees, fields, roads, and sometimes military positions carved into the frozen ground. On one early morning along a narrow stretch of farmland in eastern Ukraine, the light began rising over a small defensive position held by a Ukrainian squad. The position itself was modest. A shallow trench line dug along the edge of a field, sandbags stacked along several firing points, a small communication antenna rising above the dirt wall. Nothing about it looked dramatic from a distance, but that position held something important. It controlled a road. The road ran between two low hills and connected a cluster of villages further west. Ukrainian forces had secured that stretch days earlier, understanding that if Russian units moved through the corridor, they would gain direct access to several populated areas beyond. So the trench remained occupied, day and night. The Ukrainian squad assigned to the position had rotated through long hours of watch. Some slept in brief shifts beneath tarps stretched across the trench walls. Others remained at observation points, scanning the horizon through binoculars and night optics. War, in many places, is defined by waiting. Waiting through the dark hours, waiting for movement, waiting for confirmation that the quiet surrounding a defensive line will remain quiet. That morning began the same way many others had begun. The sky was still dim when the first soldier climbed slightly above the trench edge to observe the eastern fields. Frost covered the grass. A thin fog hovered close to the ground. The world looked still, but within minutes, something shifted. Through the pale fog, distant movement appeared along the road that curved between the hills. At first it looked small, just shapes moving along the line of the horizon. Then the soldier adjusted his binoculars. The shapes grew clearer. Vehicles, not one, several. He lowered the binoculars and spoke quietly to the soldier beside him. No shouting, no sudden alarm, just the quiet transfer of information that begins the process of preparing a defensive line. Soon the entire Ukrainian squad was awake. Some had been resting minutes earlier, wrapped in heavy coats against the cold earth. Others had been maintaining equipment inside the trench. Now everyone moved into position. Radios were checked. Ammunition confirmed. Observation points assigned. The Ukrainian squad leader studied the road through binoculars for several long seconds. The vehicles were still distant, but their direction was clear. They were moving toward the Ukrainian position. Along that same narrow road, the defenders had been watching for days. Morning light slowly continued to spread across the fields. The fog thinned slightly, and with that thinning fog came a clearer view of the approaching movement. Multiple vehicles, some larger than others. The Ukrainian squad leader lowered his binoculars. He spoke calmly into the radio connected to a nearby command post. The message was simple: movement observed, multiple vehicles approaching the defensive line. The radio responded with a short confirmation. Ukrainian units in nearby positions had also begun observing the movement. The situation was developing quickly. Inside the trench, soldiers adjusted their positions. Rifles rested across sandbags. One soldier checked the alignment of a mounted machine gun placed at the center of the defensive line. Another soldier quietly repositioned extra ammunition belts beside the weapon. No one rushed. There was no panic, just a focused rhythm of preparation. The road between the hills had become the center of everyone's attention. The vehicles continued moving closer. By now, their outlines were clearly visible against the pale morning light. The Ukrainian defenders could see several armored shapes leading the movement, followed by additional vehicles further behind. The squad leader remained steady. He spoke quietly to the soldiers along the trench line. Each position acknowledged, each field of view confirmed. The squad was small, but the position had been prepared carefully. The trench line curved slightly along the edge of the field, allowing defenders to cover multiple angles along the road. The approaching vehicles continued advancing. The distance closed gradually. The road itself was narrow, only wide enough for vehicles to move in single formation between the low hills. From their defensive position, the Ukrainian squad understood something clearly. If that formation reached the open field beyond the hills, it would pass directly in front of their trench. The morning light continued growing stronger. Frost on the grass began melting slowly. The world around the position looked calm, almost peaceful. But along the road between the hills, the situation had become unmistakable. A larger Russian force was moving forward toward a trench held by a single Ukrainian squad. One of the younger soldiers in the trench watched through his optics for several seconds before lowering them slowly. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. There are more of them than us. No one disagreed. The numbers were visible now. More vehicles, more movement. The Ukrainian squad leader listened to the radio again. Nearby Ukrainian positions were still holding their own defensive lines, but the narrow corridor of road approaching this trench had placed this particular squad directly in the path of the advancing force. For a moment, the trench fell silent. Only the faint sound of engines carried through the cold morning air. The squad leader looked down the line of soldiers, each one already in position, each one watching the road. Then he spoke calmly. His voice carried just enough to reach everyone along the trench. We hold here. No speeches, no raised voices, just that single sentence. The vehicles continued moving closer through the valley road. The distance narrowed. The light of morning spread fully across the hills of eastern Ukraine, and the small Ukrainian squad waited behind their sandbags, watching the approach of a larger Russian force moving directly toward them. One soldier adjusted his gloves and leaned slightly closer to his rifle. Another soldier steadied the mounted machine gun. The squad leader looked once more through his binoculars. Then he lowered them and said quietly, "Sometimes the line is only a few people." The engines continued approaching. The road remained open, and the Ukrainian squad held their position as the morning advanced across the fields of eastern Ukraine. Morning in eastern Ukraine had now fully arrived. The sun had not yet climbed high above the hills, but the pale light spreading across the farmland had erased the last of the night's shadows. Frost that had covered the ground earlier was slowly disappearing. From the trench line, the Ukrainian squad could now see the approaching formation clearly. Vehicles moved in a steady line along the narrow road between the hills. Their engines echoed across the open fields, carrying a low mechanical rumble that never quite faded. The defenders counted what they could see: armored vehicles at the front, additional trucks behind them. More movement following further back along the road. The Ukrainian squad leader continued observing through his binoculars. He moved slowly from one end of the trench to the other, confirming that each soldier had a clear view of their assigned area. The trench itself had been prepared with careful attention, shallow but reinforced with wooden supports, sandbags stacked high enough to provide protection without blocking the defenders' sight lines. It was not large, but it had been built for a moment exactly like this one. A road, a narrow approach, and a defensive line waiting for whatever came through it. The soldiers remained quiet as they watched the Russian formation approach. No unnecessary conversation, no wasted movement. Each person focused on the same road cutting through the hills. One soldier checked the machine gun mounted near the center of the trench. The weapon rested on a reinforced support fixed into the dirt wall. A belt of ammunition lay carefully arranged beside it. Another belt rested nearby. He adjusted the alignment slightly, making sure the barrel pointed exactly toward the road where the vehicles would appear once they passed the bend. The Ukrainian squad leader lowered his binoculars briefly and listened to the radio. Nearby Ukrainian positions continued reporting their own observations. Movement had been detected across multiple points along the front. But along this particular stretch of farmland, the approaching column remained focused on the narrow road leading directly toward the squad's trench. The squad leader spoke a short response into the radio. His voice was steady, no urgency, just confirmation that the position remained ready. Behind him, one of the younger soldiers leaned slightly against the trench wall while continuing to watch through his optics. He followed the movement of the vehicles carefully as they advanced along the road. The engines grew louder, closer now. The lead armored vehicle had reached the final curve between the hills. Once it passed that curve, the road would open into the wide field where the Ukrainian trench had been placed. The soldier beside the machine gun glanced toward the squad leader. No one needed to ask the question. Everyone already understood the situation clearly. The approaching force was larger, significantly larger, but the trench remained exactly where it had been placed, guarding the road, guarding the open field behind it, guarding the villages further west. The squad leader rested one hand against the sandbags while watching the road. For a moment, he spoke quietly, almost as if the words were meant simply to steady the silence around them. "This ground matters," no one responded. They didn't need to. Every soldier in the trench already understood why they were there. The lead Russian vehicle moved past the bend in the road. For the first time that morning, it became fully visible from the Ukrainian position. Its armored shape rolled slowly onto the straight stretch leading toward the field. The soldiers watched carefully. The vehicle did not stop. It continued forward. Behind it, the rest of the column followed. More armored vehicles, more trucks, movement filling the narrow road between the hills. Inside the trench, the machine gunner tightened his grip slightly on the weapon. He kept the barrel aligned with the road. Another soldier adjusted his position behind a sandbag firing point near the edge of the trench. The squad leader moved along the defensive line one more time. He paused briefly beside each soldier, not speaking, just confirming with a quick nod that every position was ready. Then he returned to the center of the trench and lifted his binoculars again. The Russian vehicles were now advancing directly toward the open field. The distance between the column and the Ukrainian position continued shrinking. The road offered no alternate route, no easy bypass. The narrow corridor between the hills forced every vehicle forward in a straight line, exactly toward the trench waiting at the edge of the field. The squad leader lowered the binoculars slowly. His voice carried quietly across the trench. "Hold until they enter the field." The soldiers nodded. The machine gunner adjusted the weapon once more. The ammunition belt lay ready. Another soldier placed a hand briefly against the trench wall, steadying himself while keeping his rifle aimed toward the road. Outside the trench, the farmland remained still. Wind moved lightly through the dry grass. Birds that had been resting along the distant fence line lifted into the air as the sound of engines grew stronger. The lead Russian vehicle approached the final stretch of road. The open field ahead waited. Behind the sandbags, the Ukrainian squad remained steady, watching, waiting, prepared. The armored vehicle reached the edge of the hills and began moving onto the flat ground beyond. The road straightened as it entered the field. Now the entire column could be seen clearly from the Ukrainian trench. The squad leader raised one hand slightly, a signal, no shouting. Just the quiet coordination of a group that had spent many hours preparing for a moment exactly like this. The machine gunner leaned forward slightly. The weapon remained fixed on the road. Another soldier adjusted his rifle against the sandbags. The vehicles continued advancing. The distance shortened, closer, closer still. The trench remained silent. Then the squad leader spoke again. Just one sentence, quiet enough that it did not carry beyond the trench walls. "But we are here." For a moment, the world seemed to pause between the sound of engines and the quiet readiness of the defenders. The Russian vehicles rolled further into the open field. The Ukrainian squad held their positions, and the narrow road through the hills had led the advancing force exactly where the defenders had expected it to come. The line remained unbroken. The soldiers remained steady. And the moment that had been approaching since dawn now stood directly in front of them in the fields of eastern Ukraine. Morning light had now spread fully across the farmland in eastern Ukraine. What had begun as a cold gray dawn had slowly turned into a clear and quiet morning. The frost that once covered the ground had melted away, leaving damp grass along the edge of the road. From the Ukrainian trench, the road remained the center of everything. The lead Russian armored vehicle had moved out from between the hills and into the open field. Behind it, the rest of the column followed in a steady line. Engines continued to echo across the flat land. Inside the trench, the Ukrainian squad stayed exactly where they had been placed. Sandbags lined the defensive wall. Rifles rested along the firing positions. The mounted machine gun remained fixed on the narrow road leading toward them. No one rushed. No one raised their voice. The entire defensive line moved with the quiet focus of people who understood their role and the ground they were standing on. The squad leader stood near the center of the trench. His eyes moved between the road and the soldiers beside him. He had already confirmed each position earlier, but he checked again anyway. Sometimes, in moments like this, repetition becomes a form of calm. The lead armored vehicle continued advancing slowly along the road. It had now entered the open field completely. From the trench, its details were visible. The shape of the vehicle, the dust lifting slightly from its tires as it rolled across the road. Behind it, more vehicles remained in formation. The column had not stopped. It had not turned. It had simply continued forward. The soldiers behind the sandbags watched carefully. The machine gunner followed the movement through the sight of his weapon. The long ammunition belt remained laid out beside him in careful loops. Another soldier shifted his position slightly to gain a clearer angle along the road. The squad leader listened briefly to the radio at his shoulder. Nearby, Ukrainian positions were continuing to monitor the movement as well. But along this stretch of farmland, the responsibility remained with the small trench line guarding the road. The vehicles continued approaching. The distance between the column and the Ukrainian position shortened with each passing moment. The machine gunner leaned slightly closer to the weapon. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "Still moving." The squad leader nodded.